All right, so today is Finale Friday. Jess is probably going to hate that. Yep, there's the look. Finale Friday because we are doing the finale, the finishing touches of Habakkuk. We're happy that you guys can join us today. We're just going to give a brief overview, kind of talk through some points that stood out, things that we can take away, and things that we can carry on after learning from this book of Habakkuk. So, just a reminder, Habakkuk and the structure that this book has is a lament. Jess, what is a lament?
So when we see a lament in a Bible, it's kind of like a prayer structure or when people are talking to God with complaints or concerns. Often it's expressing pretty deep emotions that are usually negative and going to God and giving it to God as we work through it. So a lament is, we see that in like Lamentations. There's a lot of lament in the Psalms. We've been working through a little bit with some of like the Tuesday things. And Habakkuk uses these prayers of lament to bring up his concerns to God. Different than other prophets where they take the word of God's and give it to the people, to Israel, Habakkuk looks at all of the destruction, the corruption going on, and goes to God as a lament to kind of bring it to God's attention and to say, hey, God, this is going on. What's happening. So that's kind of the structure of Habakkuk, and it's good to have that as a reminder because we see in the Bible when we see these prayers of lament, it's a reminder to us to take these concerns and these feelings to God and to lament to Him when we're going through hard times. And Habakkuk's was corruption in his world, which we see it again, and it kind of, I don't want to jump too far ahead, but it's this history repeating itself where people are realizing all of the corruption in like his political leaders and famine and like economic issues and war and all of this corruption, and he's going to God saying, hey, do you notice this is going on? And then the book follows a sequence of Habakkuk lament and God's response, and Habakkuk's lament and God's response.
Yeah, Habakkuk has an issue with being like, God, you made the law, but it's not being followed, and nobody's getting punished for it. So what's the point? But is bringing it to God. He's complaining. He's not saying that God isn't at work. He's just saying, why is this happening? How is this happening if you're God? And really, that's what we're called to do. And what's the big line that God responds with, right? When Habakkuk goes, God, why is all of this happening? And God is kind of just puts Habakkuk back in his place. This is one of my favorite lines.
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out where exactly it is. Yes, but I think what's unique to point out in this too is one of the things that's important to recognize about lament is it's not necessarily Habakkuk saying, hey, this is happening, God, fix it this, and this way, but opening up to why is this happening, what's going on. And God's first response says, look among the nations and see, wonder and be astonished, for I am doing a work in your days that you would not believe if I told you. So it's God saying, hey, Habakkuk, like, don't worry, I'm still working. Like,
I got this.
But even if I told you, you wouldn't believe it. And I think that that's oftentimes the way God works, is it's not always explicitly what we ask for, what we expect, but it's all of these moving pieces that come together for his plan in ways that we wouldn't even think of.
Mm-hmm. And I think that a lot of times, just in terms of life, this is me speaking from my experience, I like to kind of line up my dots and then connect the line myself. And when the dots all of a sudden go all over the place, and I'm like, well, the line doesn't go through anymore. God, what's up with that? That's God using ways to kind of direct my steps because that's his plan. He's got something in store that is far better than I could ever envision.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's cool to see an example of that, and especially someone who's asking questions, right? Being like, what's going on? Because oftentimes we're kind of, it's easy to read some books of the Bible and to be like, all right, here are the do's and the don'ts. It doesn't ever feel deep or real or kind of connected to that. But this is a great example of this kind of struggle, right? But looking out and wanting things to happen, but things not being reflective of Habakkuk's own understanding. And I think what's really cool throughout this is to see the transformation that Habakkuk goes through himself.
Yeah, I was going to bring that up because I think it's a good reflection of what we should aim for in prayer when we look at these laments and we look at how Habakkuk's prayers to God and the way that he develops through the very short 3 chapters of a book is a great tool for us to look at to say, what does my prayer life look like? Or what do I expect when I say these things? Because it's easy for us to go to God in prayer with like a laundry list of like, here's all the bad things, like here's what we need. And it's important to be able to give those things to him. But prayer isn't about changing the will of God, it's changing our understanding of his plan. So, and Habakkuk goes through that with when he goes and talks to God. It's not to, I mean, he laments and he brings these things to God's attention. But what happens is not God's plan changed for the people, but it's Habakkuk's understanding and willingness to submit and to trust God is what changes throughout the book, not how God's handling the situation in Israel. And I think that that's an important thing to recognize as we see this shift. So Habakkuk has the first prayer of lament, and then God's response is, I'm doing a work. And he goes on to tell Habakkuk about how he's raising up the Chaldeans, which is basically their like mortal enemies, to come and bring justice to Israel. And Habakkuk's response is then, why are you doing that? To say like, this is the bad plan because these are even worse people.
You know how bad they are, right,
on?
God? Right? And God goes on to say that he's doing it to produce a work in his people, right? I think he goes on to say that the righteous are going to live by faith. Like, this is the transformation that's going to come about because of it.
Yeah. And it's not limiting the tools that God can use to help teach humanity these lessons and to bring judgment. I think it says to bring judgment to the head of the evil house. Like, that he's using these tools to bring justice to the people who aren't following his law and to help shape his people.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's, Habakkuk arrives at this point. I really love what he says at the beginning of 3. It says, O Lord, I have heard the report of you and your work. O Lord, do I fear. In the midst of the years, revive it. In the midst of the years, make it known. In wrath, remember mercy. That's Habakkuk in verses 3-2. 2 chapters ago, he was going, God, what's up? Where is this? But now he's pleading that as God is going to work, that his mercy would abound. And I really love the verse you brought up too. That was kind of 3:13, where it speaks to the idea that it says, you went out for the salvation of your people, for the salvation of your anointed. God is going forth. I think a little bit, if we're going to look at Habakkuk as a person a little bit, I think Habakkuk wished that things could have been accomplished a certain way. I think
Well, most of us do. We have a plan and an idea of what we expect, and Habakkuk's no different than that.
Right. And God uses that as an example to show us that, hey, things are working. You need to realign. And this is what you said too, Jess, about prayer. But I think one of my favorite things to pull away from this book is the very end. I don't know if you want to talk about that, but just at the very end, Habakkuk is laying it all bare, and he's like, all right, this is what I can do.
Yeah, and Becca did a great job looking at those last week, so this part should be pretty fresh on our minds if we've been following along with the devos that are posted. But so I'm just going to read 17 and 18, which are like the beginning of the end of the book of Habakkuk there, and it says, so the fig tree should not blossom, though the fruits on the vines they produce... The fruit of the olive fail, the fields yield no food, the flock be cut off from the fold, there will be no herd in the stalls, yet I will rejoice in the Lord, I will take joy in the God of my salvation. So Habakkuk really summarizes and comes back to, and the point here is an example of how the righteous live by faith. So Habakkuk recognizes how dark the world is, and he still is concerned and aware of the injustice that's there, but he invites us and he shows an example of how by prayer and faith we can live and we can trust in God even if we don't see the fruit and don't see that plan and the way God is working. That God loves the world more than Habakkuk could. He loves the people of Israel and he loves the world more than we could, and has a plan to deal with its evil and to bring justice, and we should trust in that even when we don't see it or are having a hard time comprehending.
I think something to model our own lives after going forward too is that it's okay to have prayers of lament. We're encouraged to do that, to bring things before God, but to test them against God, and to then wait and to learn and to grow from that, to let God change our hearts, to let God work in us so that we can get to the point of, I will rejoice in the Lord. I will take joy, right? Previously, Habakkuk's complaining. He's miserable. He's down in the dumps. Now there's joy in the God of his salvation because he knows that God is working.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a word we all need for today.
And I think it's particularly important to recognize that, like, when we're all like writing essays in school or whatever, the conclusion is the takeaway point, right? So when we look at the end and how it wraps up, like, he still has all of these concerns. He has all those woes that we go through, and frankly, it's kind of shocking to me how similar, like, the way that history repeats itself, like the concerns that Habakkuk has about injustice and corruption and suffering and economic systems that are set up for failure, like all these things are very reflective of the world we live in now. But even as history repeats itself, God is using these tools to teach humanity and to help us rely and trust on him. And at the end, where Habakkuk, at the end is a prayer of like rejoicing in the Lord and the trust in him, and that's where he falls, that's where he lands, that's where the book summarizes, and we see the end of the story. And that's where we need to land too, is even as we work through all these prayers and the laments and struggle with injustice that we're seeing today, at the end of the day, no one loves the world more than God does, and we need to trust and rest in his plan, even as we work through all these laments or issues we see.
And Habakkuk too arrived at this point of joy in the God of his salvation, not even knowing how that would fully happen. We get to live in the light of knowing that Christ has already come, he's already paid for it all, and he's coming again. So that's the hope that we have. That's the joy that transforms our lives, and that's what we're called to just live in the light of, especially as the days are dark, because sin entangles and snares, but God has given Christ to redeem us.
Yeah.
So let's live in the light of that. Would love to hear any of your own takeaways from this, and look forward to just continuing to learn and grow with you guys as we go forward.